The bridge of the Vanguard didn't hum. It rattled with the violent, rhythmic thrum of engines pushed 3 points past their thermal redline. Sarah Vance gripped the edge of the command console, her knuckles white against the matte carbon fiber. Outside the view screen, the Iron Gate Nebula was a bruised purple smear of ionized gas and gravity pockets that should have crushed a frigate like a tin can. But the 12 Terran ships behind her weren't stopping. They were accelerating. They were diving into the crushing pressure of the well because the math said they would die, and Sarah had already stopped listening to the math. She looked at the sensor ghost of the swarm's hive ship, a mountain of chitin and pulse fire, and felt a strange, cold clarity. Humans don't know they're supposed to lose. The silence of acceptable losses had been the only sound in the High Council chamber an hour ago. Sarah could still see Ambassador Elias Thorne standing before the Draconian lords, his spine straight while they looked down from their floating obsidian dais. The Hegemony was a machine of logic and ancient stagnant protocols. They had calculated the attrition rates for Oros. They had weighed the lives of 4 billion colonists against the cost of a fleet engagement and found the colonists wanting. Oros is a statistical outlier. The High Prime had hissed, its scales clicking with a sound like dry bone. To defend it is to invite a deficit we cannot afford. We choose the stability of the many over the sacrifice of the few. Elias hadn't argued. He hadn't pleaded. He had simply looked at the holographic display of the swarm descending like a shroud over the frontier world and tapped a sequence into his private comms. 4 words that haunt the stars left his lips, whispered into a channel that bypassed every bureaucratic layer of the Hegemony. Vanguard, execute Spearhead Prime. The snapback to the present was a jolt of turbulence that nearly threw Sarah from her feet. The nebula was screaming now, a literal acoustic resonance shaking the hull as they hit the first gravity shear. Admiral, the Draconian monitors are hailing us, hissing that we're violating high sector transit laws. The comms officer shouted over the roar of the venting coolant. They're calling it a suicide mission. Sarah wiped a smear of sweat from her brow, her eyes locked on the tactical overlay. The swarm functioned on a centralized hive mind, a massive interconnected logic web that relied on superior numbers and predictable physics. They expected a wall of ships. They expected a standoff. They didn't expect 12 tiny jury-rigged frigates to use the nebula's own crushing gravity as a slingshot. It's only a suicide mission we somehow survive, Sarah muttered. She felt the vibration change. It was deeper now, a bone-shaking groan from the Vanguard structural supports. They were deep in the soup of the Iron Gate, using illegal gravity wells to mask their heat signatures. The Hegemony fleets were still back at the Citadel, debating the ethics of abandonment, but the Terran ships were already ghosts in the machine. They were the variable the aliens couldn't compute, the refusal to wait for permission to stay alive. "Launch the anchors," Sarah commanded. The ship bucked as the first magnetic tether fired, hooking into a dense pocket of dark matter. They weren't just flying. They were tethering themselves to the universe's own weight, to pivot at speeds that shouldn't be possible. The Vanguard groaned as the magnetic tethers snapped taut, the ship pivoting on a point of pure gravity that should have torn the hull into shimmering ribbons. Sarah felt the G-force pressing her into the command chair, a heavy, suffocating weight that turned her vision into a narrow tunnel of red and black. But through the haze she saw it, the hive ship. It was a bloated organic fortress, unaware that 12 ghosts were about to materialize inside its defensive perimeter. The Draconian lords were still broadcasting demands for a retreat, their voices tinny and frantic over the long-range comms. They were calculating the risk to the Hegemony's reputation, while the Terran fleet was calculating the exact millisecond to release the anchors. "Mark," Sarah gasped, her lungs struggling against the pressure. The tethers released. The Vanguard and its 11 sisters shot out of the Iron Gate Nebula like stones from a sling, their velocity tripled by the gravitational whip. They didn't come in a standard tactical formation. They came in a chaotic, overlapping swarm of their own, a decentralized mess that the hive ship's automated targeting arrays couldn't prioritize. The first frigate, the Jakarta, took a direct hit to its port thruster, spinning wildly, but it didn't stop firing. It used its momentum to drift closer, dumping its entire payload of nuclear-tipped harpoons into the hive ship's sensory clusters. This was the asymmetric gamble. The swarm was a monolith of logic, designed to crush organized resistance through sheer scale. It wasn't built to handle 12 frantic, biting insects that didn't care about their own structural integrity. Sarah watched the tactical map as the hive ship began to turn, its massive bulk laboring to face the new threat. "Too slow. Bring us into the shadow of the main spire," Sarah commanded, her voice steady now that the action had blurred into instinct. "Give them the dirty fuel." The Vanguard dove. It skimmed so close to the hive ship's hull that the screech of atmospheric friction echoed through the bridge. They weren't just using missiles anymore. They were venting concentrated, irradiated coolant and magnesium flares directly into the hive ship's intake vents. A desperate, improvised tactic that ignored every rule of engagement in the Hegemony handbook. The hive ship shuddered. A chain reaction began deep within its core, a ripple of orange fire blooming beneath the translucent chitin of its skin. On the view screen, the Citadel's high-frequency channel flickered to life. It was Elias Thorne. He wasn't looking at the Draconian Lords anymore. He was looking at the sensor feed of the exploding hive. "The math has changed," the ambassador said, his voice echoing in the silence of the Vanguard's bridge. The hive ship didn't just break. It folded. The jury-rigged gravity wells the Terrans had dragged out of the nebula collapsed inward, creating a localized singularity that sucked the swarm's command structure into a silent, crushing point of nothingness. When the light cleared, the swarm was a leaderless mass of drifting husks. Oros was safe. Days later, the Vanguard limped back toward the Citadel of Ethelgard, its hull scorched and its atmosphere venting from a dozen microfractures. As they approached the docking ring, the multi-species fleet of the Hegemony, the massive dreadnoughts that had sat idle during the slaughter, parted like a sea of glass. The Iowa salute. They didn't broadcast a welcome. They watched in a terrifying, respectful silence. In the High Council chamber, the Draconian Lords stood as Elias Thorne walked back to the center of the floor. The air was different now. The bystander effect had been shattered by the sight of 12 small ships doing what an empire wouldn't. The High Prime looked at the casualty reports, the scars on the human ships, the sheer impossibility of the victory. It clicked its scales, but the sound wasn't dismissive anymore. It was a tremor of realization. "You did not calculate the cost," the Prime hissed. "We didn't have to," Elias replied, his voice carrying the weight of the men and women currently sleeping in the medbays of the Vanguard. "We just decided that Arras wasn't for sale." The Hegemony didn't grant humanity a seat on the council because they suddenly found them charming. They did it because they realized that a species that refuses to lose is a species you cannot afford to leave outside the room. The silence of acceptable losses was over. The era of the variable had begun.